All right. I'm here with Longstone. Welcome.
Brian, good to see you again.
Yeah, I appreciate you doing this. I've been keeping my eye on some of the things you've been doing for a while, and that includes Twitter and some of the posts that you put up on medium.com and then various communication platforms that we've been in touch on via social media. And I've always been interested in the type of ideas that you seem to come up with. So I figured it's time for us to have a podcast.
Sounds good.
So yeah. So I guess first, one of the things I observe about you, and you can tell me if I'm onto anything, is that you've got a complex understanding, a meta framework that includes biological processes, psychological processes, and occult phenomena. Is that an adequate thing to say? Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable summary. I mean, my work background is in software and systems architecture, and I've also got what are we looking at now? Close to 20 years in Freemasonry.
Wow.
Through most of the orc rite. Yeah, it's like 7 different Masonic bodies and I think 21 different degrees and orders. I'd have to actually enumerate to go through it, but yeah, a reasonable depth of experience in both the system side of thing and the mystery tradition side of thing. The mystery traditions exploration actually started with me looking at some Neolithic prehistory in the Ontario area, doing some research into shamanism, and then kind of following that technological trail from the ancient to the modern and trying to understand that transformation.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Given my study of Jung, that's clearly a topic of interest for me. First question that pops up in terms of Freemasonry is, it's sort of a taboo subject, right? People hear Freemasonry, they don't really know what it is. What is it all about? There's kind of a secrecy that seems or appears to surround it from the outside looking in. So, what are you at liberty to say about that? Or is there anything that you can give us to kind of understand what that's all about?
There is a lot. Candidly, I'm better at asking questions, but I'll go over some quick stuff. Freemasonry, as I see it, is a mystery tradition as opposed to being a religious or orthodox tradition. So going back to what I spoke to about Paleolithic shamanism, that's basically the foundation of all religious experience. And then you go through a period of cultural encoding and development where you reach a bifurcation point where you're either going to go into an orthodoxy, so a system 1 type learning, or into a mystery tradition, which is system 2 type learning. So those two types of those two learning systems have impact on the knowledge that we're able to create, and also the way we're able to update and modify those models. So things that are learned through system 1, kind of narrative, so the mimetic approach, straight up mimicry, following Girardian ideas.
Right.
That tends to be information that we're not easily able to upgrade or modify or change it. Like, we're kind of stuck in that framework. Somebody told me so, it's got to be true, and I'm emotionally attached to that kind of space. Whereas when you learn something by process or through a methodology, you're able to tweak and fine tune that methodology as you go along, especially as you kind of master those technologies or whatever. So that is,
got it.
for me, that's the fundamental structural breakdown for spirituality as I see it.
And so it sounds like Freemasonry is deeply connected to System 2.
Yeah, very much. So like most mystery traditions, it uses the structure of the object lesson, which is literally taking a physical object. So the common one for Masons is square and compasses. So those objects are used to teach moral principles. That's a common aspect of almost any structure of mystery tradition. So despite the fact that all of the liturgy of Freemasonry is based off of the Old Testament, it has more in common with Buddhism as a system of practice than it does with Christianity. Because it's not about afterlife, it's about making good men better here and now.
Yeah.
So part of that is the ritual work. So the craft lodge, or the blue lodge as they call it, those are the 3 principal degrees of Freemasonry. You can go on to York or Scottish Rite from there within the American and Canadian jurisdictions, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. That everyone who's a Mason is a craft Mason or a Master Mason. So there's the degrees and the structures kind of mimic themselves and repeat and kind of do like a Jacob's ladder thing as you kind of go up the chain with the different degrees. What they all share in common is that each degree or order is it's a narrative structure in which you're placing the candidate so they can experience the story, so the system one part, from a certain character's perspective. So the Master Mason's degree is the character Hiram a bit. So each of these degrees goes through a narrative, giving some part of a story, and then there will be what are called the tools of the degree that are an adjunct lesson that you're supposed to take and kind of contemplate on and figure out what it means to you. So that's the difference between Orthodoxy and the mystery traditions. Like, here's a set of rules, here's a set of tools. The two very, very different approaches to moral pedagogy.
Right. One is much more of a closed loop. The other one's more open-ended.
Yeah, it's giving you a set of tools and a systems with some mentorship in order to do your own exploration. So that's
right. So there's a phenomenological freedom.
Yeah, and you see that within, despite the fact that the liturgy is all based off of the Old Testament, if someone's a Muslim, joins a lodge, at least in the Canadian jurisdiction, then the Quran has to be there on the altar beside the Bible, regardless of whether or not he's in attendance. If he's a member of that lodge, that book needs to be there.
And that's a way of just honoring different epistemological approaches.
So, yeah, we use the term the volume of the sacred law. And that can come from different traditions, even though the liturgy and the ritual is explicitly based off the Old Testament, generally speaking. The Knights Templar within the York Rite is explicitly Christian, and the bodies above that are, but otherwise, all of Freemasonry is open to all different faiths.
It strikes me as incredibly complex and nuanced, and like a deep way of immersing yourself in a transformational learning experience for years and years. It seems like it's similar to martial arts in the sense that there's many levels, there's many disciplines, there's many things to master. Is that an appropriate analogy?
Besides that, there is less emphasis. Sorry, every Master Mason is charged with making an advancement in Masonic knowledge every day. So that means pushing yourself to explore. What happens in a more practical sense is the running of the organization itself. So when you join the organization, there's some expectation that you will go through what are called the officers' chairs, which are the duties and responsibilities. And at some point, there's an expectation that you will hopefully go through the master's chair and become the master of the lodge or the past master, and so on. So each of those chairs that you go through is a different set of responsibilities and duties within an organization. And Masonic meetings, by and large, are run under Robert's Rules of Order. There's a clear structure there. It's nobody's business outside what the minutes and the finances are, but everyone who has a member has full access to that information. So that happens at the local body level, that happens at the district level, and then that happens at the grand body level above that. So there's transparency through that organization. And candidly, most Masonic bodies that I'm aware of have a webpage, so they're not really that secret. The big confusion that most people have is the idea that someone's going to come and recruit you. It doesn't happen. You have to become a Freemason of your own free will and accord. You have to ask one to be one. We do not solicit membership. Once you're in, you might get solicited into other organizations, like some or different Masonic bodies are invitation only, but at the basis foundation of Freemasonry, you have to join of your own free will and accord. It has to be your drive and ambition to do it. Can't be on someone else's behest or behalf.
Oh, that's cool. That's interesting. What has it given you to be a part of? What are the gains that you've seen through your life, the way that you've been able to contribute to others, but also how you experience your life?
I think it gives you the chance to apply discipline. So talking about that Paleolithic to modern thread ago before. Coming back, I'll subsection of that. I've always been interested in the journey from Genghis Khan to modern Tibetan Buddhism. So from Temujin to Tenzin, the only true battles are within. That's a little phrase that I came up with. It's like, within the warrior's tradition, you come to the exercise and application of discipline. At a certain point, that becomes internalized, and that's where the real growth can happen. So to have the most rapacious horde on the face of the planet become the forefathers of modern Tibetan Buddhism, because the term Dalai Lama goes back to the Genghis Khan's time. The Tibetan Buddhists can consider themselves the sons of Genghis Khan. So that transformational journey, what I see is at the root of that is basically this application of discipline. And that's what the ritual work allows you to do in terms of memorization of the ritual and being able to present, rather than if you read something through a degree and fumble through it, then that's going to give a really shitty impression to the candidate in terms of what your level of investment is, what their expected level of investment is. If you can read a part, because this is to a degree, it's a type of theater. The ritual is a type of theater. The more effectively you can portray that, the more it's going to mean to the candidate, and the more that story is going to have some hook and some depth. If someone's kind of mumbling through it, then it doesn't really work. So for a lot of people, unless you've maybe got a law background or something like that, the memorization stuff takes work. Understanding the floor work of where and when you move within the ritual and different things that need to happen, that also takes application discipline to learn that and get it down. And each of the chairs and responsibilities that you go through. So one might be, I have to prepare the lodge for a specific degree, or the secretary, treasurer, all those kind of standard parts are there as well. So all these responsibilities and duties are kind of broken down, laid out in chain of command, such as you would have in a workspace or something like that. The opportunity for people to go through each of those different chairs and learn those duties and responsibilities is kind of a way of like really rounding you out as a person.
Say that last part one more time. Really
going through all those different chairs and responsibilities and learning how to master and do these things is really a way of kind of rounding you out as a person. So you have a really good diversity basis of experience that you can carry out into life and other things that you are engaged in.
Well, yeah, it sounds like it's an incredibly meaningful thing to have the structure. It seems like it strikes a good balance between chaos and order, or exploration and instruction, in the sense that there's pre-established rituals, things that, patterns of execution that you have to fulfill, and there's the honoring of you as an individual.
And the expectation that you will go beyond the basic lessons that you learned there to actually explore yourself under your own volition.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's, I think, effectively what the occult journey is. I mean, occult means hidden, but more explicitly hidden within.
Yes.
So this great undiscovered country might be the other side of death, but it might also be the internals of our own psychology, which I think has Masonry has this idea, or regards itself as a moral philosophy. And I've always taken that idea fairly seriously, and it was part of the reason I started digging into the psychological research as well as some other interests, but trying to understand the mechanisms behind that and have some basis or comprehension of morality that isn't based on moral relativism. So this ties into another idea. So the Masons use the term the volume of sacred law rather than saying the Bible. So when we refer to a volume of sacred law, a lot of people are talking about paper. It was obviously written by people. Divinity only writes in 4 letters, and those are the sequence that created this genome. So if we want to think about our relationship to the sacred word, then we need to start thinking about concepts of eustress and distress. When you put distress onto this thing, you are degrading that sacred vessel. So I think that's a way of taking the principles of those ideas, but giving them a frame of reference that's actually meaningful in a modern context. So without distorting them, trying to peel away layers so that they mean something in a modern and coherent, relevant context.
So You just for a second, two things. One, that's very fascinating. I have some thoughts on that. Two is the audio is breaking up a little bit. So the choice juncture on my end is we either just deal with it and it is what it is, or we just do audio only and that should smooth out the audio.
Yeah, we can try that.
Try it. Okay, I'll turn off my video then. Let's try it. Okay, let's try it this way because I really want to be able to hear what you're saying clearly. So really what I understand in what you're saying is that you're trying to map values onto underlying principles in nature. And in a sense, you're healing that Cartesian dualism that says, hey, like there's this inner world and then there's this outer world. But really, no, there's a coherence that pierces through all things, and nature is not fundamentally separate, but that somehow we can find a moral sense of purpose within that. Am I anywhere close to what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I'll dip into Nietzsche a little bit here for the idea of the eternal recurrence.
Okay.
And I'll contest Peterson's reading of him. So one of Peterson's problems with Nietzsche is that he thinks that you have to go and build everything from scratch from the foundations. And I think that's just kind of a poor interpretation of the idea. What you have to do is go to the foundations of culture and psychology and build your way back up. Like the substructure of the foundation is there, but unless you've worked your way back up from the root to the leaf, then you don't really understand that whole journey.
Okay. So can you say a little more about that?
I'm finding it harder without the face contact, actually.
we can go back to the other one if you want. I just want to make sure I can hear you.
Yeah, let's do that because I feel like I'm just talking to myself. It's kind of strange.
It's fine. We'll just deal with it if there's a couple patchy areas.
Okay, so Nietzsche, the idea of the eternal recurrence. So we're just kind of repeating these patterns. You need to go through sinusoidal waves. So there's a growth pattern, there's a destructive pattern. And these things kind of play themselves out and repeat each other over time. So much analogous to Peterson's psychological reading of the Bible, treating it as a repository of psychological knowledge that has been transferred into narrative. That I think we had this part of the 50 million directions at once. This is one of the core issues with the modern atheism or atheist fundamentalism or theistic nihilism, however you want to describe that. We'll pick the dumbest argument in the room, which in this context is religious fundamentalism.
Right.
And let that frame the argument.
Right.
And fight against that straw man where it's not actually helpful. Yes, we have these old systems and yes, they're outdated. It's because we have advanced, but they were the best interpretations that were available to us at the time. And we kind of ignore that at our own peril. So much like the idea, we're not wiping the slate clean, but we do have to go into the foundations and the leaky basement and clean shit up on a regular basis. This is just like societal maintenance, same thing you do with a house.
Yep.
So we need to kind of do that editing, error checking process kind of at an individual level and also at a cultural, metacultural level. But most people just treat it as like arc from birth to death. That'll also breaks into another piece with near-death experience and ego death, and how basically ego death within ritual is a ritualization of near-death experience. So it's at that point where you're able to give up and relinquish everything and start over, that you're actually able to cleanse the sins of the past, if you want to use that wording, but to give yourself the psychological space to actually advance instead of being tied to older stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
So a lot of it's is kind of weird flip flops back and forth as you're going through context, like a bit of a Jacob's ladder kind of thing. But and I'm sorry, all of the subject matters just like breaks off into a million different subjects.
No, it's great. It's
Production.
great.
So it's hard to
it's a dynamic subject.
constrain
So.
the yeah.
Well, it's all very fascinating. I mean, I'm curious about values. You know, to me, values are an interesting topic. I mean, you know, on one hand, I see values as a problem of functionality, right? So there's an evolutionary component where you look at values and you say, well, what's valuable really is what works. You know, what promotes efficiency on an individual level, on a social level. Sometimes we have values that promote efficiency on a social level at the peril of the individual, or vice versa. So for me, there is, I mean, there ultimately the relativity of values is in the sense that we perhaps we can only know them within the sphere of human functioning. And sometimes we, as Nietzsche, I think, was quick to point out, we adopt values from our culture without reflecting on whether or not they're actually applicable or resonant internally. So can you comment on the problem of values? I don't find, see, I find the postmodern argument to be contemptible. But there's also the tendency to go to the other side of the extreme and say, well, there's universal values that go beyond human beings, which is an unknowable premise. It may or may not be true.
So I think we have a solid basis in Haidt's moral foundation stuff. I think I sent you the pictures where I've kind of broken that out in terms of where it places in an evolutionary history, and especially the evolution of society and culture. So purity is really ancient. So socialized group animals, I mean, we can go all the way back to lobsters for that, but I'm basically looking at like primates and advanced culture.
Yeah,
in that context. So monkeys will not touch food that's been close to a piece of poop.
Right.
And that's the kind of purity thing coming in. When it comes into, or it kind of goes, so from this biological substrate, which I think we talked about before, you get the biological substrate, and then that system is kind of hacked and repurposed to do a completely different task at a more abstracted level.
Yes.
So you got the purity thing at the biological substrate, and at the cultural level, then it becomes about purity of values.
Yes.
So each of these things kind of abstract out. So I think the purity thing is probably the oldest. The harm care dynamic would be just older than that, because that's, I think, at least in my mind, it's tied into the grandparenting function, which is at least 2 to 3 million years old. So that's the first time you have a bonding that is beyond pair bonding and beyond parent-child bonding, as soon as it extends to a second generation. So there is a step in abstraction there. And that provides a foundation in order for the small social group and family dynamics to kind of play out. And then as you go up, the other parts of the moral foundation, they can't evolve without a social context. The only reason they exist is because social context is already there.
Right.
So I think in terms of our evolution as a bunch of meat bags, that's part of the problem.
Right.
Because these higher level functions aren't consistent across cultures, especially their interpretation of them. And they're not that developed in terms of breadth across society, because we still had a very rural population, most of the world, up until 50, 60 years ago.
Right.
So until you get enough people in density, in complexity, some of these other more abstract relationships don't really matter. So like above and below the Dunbar number. So things that are going to work very well at the village level don't necessarily scale up. I mean, the principles will scale, but the pattern itself is not reproducible all the way up. You run into scaling issues or throttling issues in terms of resource or whatever else.
One of the things I'm interested in is where collectivized values become dysfunctional. Very common and perhaps cliche example is, well, men don't cry. Well, where did we get that from? Well, there is clearly some abstraction, if we can take your language, of toughness and warriorhood, and something happened that got imported into our culture somewhere along the way, of how men feel and how men should feel and how men talk about themselves and how men relate to being human and having emotions.
I think it's a resolution issue principally.
Say more.
So like Peterson's argument, I think most of our problems are due to people seeing things in far too low of resolution.
Low resolution.
So if you look at people who I'll say are really fucking stupid, frequently they're right in the way they've construed and constrained their context. And if you look at just what they're thinking about, they're on track. As soon as you widen it out to actually include anything in the real world, it's smoke and mirrors and it just falls apart. So this reductionism is a fundamental problem, I think, at the social level, at our in terms of ecological, systemic challenges and everything else. Like we're shitty at dealing with complexity in the first place. Right. And our culture is doing all kinds of things to undermine our ability to actually deal with complexity in any meaningful manner. So like the good and evil arguments, there goes IQ 10%. All kinds of distress, moral panic issues, there goes another 30% of IQ. So you're dealing with a population that doesn't have that much to work with in the first place, because don't forget the bell end of the bell curve there at 100 IQ, 1 sigma below that is at the level where you're unteachable in the eyes of the US Army.
Right.
This is a significant part of the population. This is not a trivial issue.
Right. And, no, I'm aware. Yeah.
Yeah. The cognitive skill thing is, I don't really know how to deal with it, because we basically have different populations in terms of that level. Like, and I don't know, it's weird. I know construction workers who I can talk to about system stuff and they get it. And I can talk to people who are educated and they have zero clue. Like
what
some of this
comes about.
Yeah, in terms of raw systems principles. So some of this comes down to the interaction with the physical world, where there are real consequences and you learn from your failures, or you have to face the consequences of your failures. And there's, things actually play out. You have to deal with the failure in order to proceed. So that's a different modality than kind of wishy-washing your way around with language and not actually having to take a stand for any, or put yourself physically in any kind of space, or even metaphorically in any kind of space where you're actually in danger from the consequences of your actions. So you have to deal with the consequences of your actions, or you have the responsibility for dealing with your choices and those consequences on other people. You tend to have a very different approach to problems, because the outcomes actually fucking matter. So you can't piss around with rhetoric. You need to do stuff that is actually going to work, and for God's sakes, like, not be worse than useless, like not create bigger fucking problems than we already have in the first place. And much of our culture is operating on the, let's just make the problem bigger. It's not helpful.
Yeah. We have an incredibly low threshold for complexity in terms of psychological understanding and processes. And for example, people don't know how to deal with their internal conflicts. They just squash themselves into this single voice where there's no conception of the fact of the multiplicity of who we are, or the idea that, Peterson talks about, that you have to find a way to organize yourself into a hierarchy of values, or what I like to think about it in terms of listening to your soul, which is really parallel to an occult phenomenon, like you said, looking on the inside rather
that
than
inner
the
voice,
outside.
however you want to define it. But
Yeah.
having that quiet inner voice, the one that speaks the truth, trying to figure out how to tap into that.
Well, because to me, that's like, and obviously I've had the great privilege of learning from Strachan, who's been doing this work for his whole life. So I've got a leg up. But I mean, to me, the soul is the CEO, so to speak, or the boss, and all the sub personalities have to learn how to listen. he has a joke. He doesn't like working with dumb people. He says, "No, Mrs. Johnson, it's not okay for you to hit your kid over the head with a baseball bat." He has no patience for it. So his whole career, he really focused on working with highly or more intelligent, functional people because he just found that it was much more effective. So you're right; it is a really difficult problem, and the way he solved it is, I'm just not going to work. I'm just not going to go there.
And to be blunt, that's kind of what we're facing. Mm-hmm. At a wide societal level. We're going to have serious conversations about this. I had a friend who died of cancer in late summer, fall, and I spent about a week and a half with him in palliative care. And it's like he and his partner were kind of in denial of it. He didn't want to go to the hospital. They didn't really want to talk to anybody else, but I was kind of reaching out just because I knew he wasn't doing well. And then I got the call they were doing really rough. So just me and his kids looking after him like 24 hours a day for the first little bit until we finally got the nurses and stuff in there. But when people are that disadvantaged, and I say this without kind of any hyperbolic context, in terms of where my friend was with his physical condition, some people are very fucking close to that mentally. Like there's not much there to work with. It's not their fault, but for God's sakes, don't let them near the power tools. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's a real conversation that we need to have, because we have people who are fucking infants, like utterly 3-year-old infants at the reins of power. And this is a recipe for fucking disaster.
Now, do you think, like, I always, I had a guy named Randy Russell who was a great mentor of mine when I was younger. And he said, some of the people running our country are like 12 or 10 years old. Now, he was looking at it from a perspective of like this kind of regressive psychological development that they were never mentored properly. But, obviously, if you understand genetics, you might understand that the problem goes a bit deeper than just that. Now, there might be developmental failures, or there might be ways in which things don't go sequence through the system properly or efficiently, or you get a couple bad breaks and things don't click. But what do you make of that? I mean, there's a fine line there between the developmental failure and a genetic proclivity that's somewhat predestined, and it's difficult to figure out where that line is because of the epigenetic uncertainty, which is to say that how things get translated into the phenotypic behaviors, actions, traits are context dependent.
I think some of this is around boundary issues between childhood and adult, like the loss of rites of passage. I think that's a significant factor in that we don't have this clear boundary. It's like, you're not a kid, you don't get to play the little emotional shit anymore. You need to adult the fuck up so we can actually solve problems here.
Right.
So there are issues with that. There are issues, I think, with education, basically being set up like factory farming.
Oh God! By the way, I had a horrible time in school growing up. Horrible. So I'm with you there. It was not for me.
On top of that, since the late 1870s into the 1880s, so that's kind of the earliest seeds of the advertising or consumerism. So they had catalogs before that, but the catalog was, here's the thing, here's what it comes with, here's how much it is. This whole idea of tying the product to your state of being. This product isn't going to let me wash clothes, or this product's going to give me a better life. That whole hook started in like around the 1870s, really kicked off through like post World War I. And then by the time Bernays did his Lucky Strike campaign in like 22, 23, they nailed it down. They had the pattern down. So that's when Bernays' work went into,
You're going to have to provide me with a little context. I'm not familiar with Bernays.
Edward Bernays, he's considered the father of modern propaganda. He was a nephew of Freud, I believe.
Okay.
I think he actually spent some time hanging out with Young too, because I think they were peripherally related.
Okay.
You know?
Thanks.
You know, he came to the States. He did a seminal work called Propaganda. He's also responsible for one of these quotes where the wealthy people who don't know how to do well have to leave the ignorant masses alone. So I think there's two sides of that coin where, we're kind of seeing the detrimental effects of that, but we're also at the point where we kind of need that, but we need it done right. Instead of manipulating people into dead end troughs, it's like, okay, here's tools and go off and work in some kind of direction, like figure something out. So there's a lot of compound problems there. The consumerism into social media has just like destroyed a lot of culture.
You know,
there were some significant challenges over culture, like up into, so you see the Saturday morning cartoons is a phase where now it's cool to advertise to kids and start sliding that, just prodding the limbic system back earlier and earlier in developmental life, while all of the superstructure to actually develop gets kind of swept away. So that's been a kind of transformational thing over the last 100 years. And then within the last 10, 15 years, like Web 2.0, it's a neurotransmitter economy. Mm-hmm. Like the products aren't the things anymore, really. It doesn't, it matters to the people down here, but the people up here, it's the data that matters.
Right.
Because you can predict, because you can drive, because you can figure out which moral panic issue is going to get you the right audiences to push in the right direction by figuring out the distribution.
Right, which is just an incredibly pernicious and awful way to run a business, in my estimation. I mean, I just try to put myself in the shoes of running one of those companies, and I would be sick to my stomach knowing that was what I was doing. I wouldn't be able to live myself. I don't understand how some people see. This is where subpersonalities come in, and genetics and differences and temperament. I just don't get it. I just don't understand how some people live with themselves. I've done some shitty things in my life that I don't feel great about. I've heard, I've lost my temper one too many times, had some violent tendencies when I was younger. But there's a way in which, like now, as a developed adult, there's certain things that people live with. I don't know how they live with it. I mean, how do you live with, psychiatry is a, $795, I think, $1 billion industry, and how do you live with yourself at the top of that industry, knowing that it's 50% or more bullshit?
Well, once you get into the industry, I mean, it doesn't matter. People don't really want to learn. If you have a high value product, but is going to take people work to figure something out, they don't fucking want it. They want the easy way out. Like if you haven't figured out some aspect of introspection by the time you're 14, so basically finish puberty, you're probably not going to see it. If you haven't figured it out by 27, 29, in that range, it's never going to happen in your life unless trauma forces you into that position. So
you think people have major blind spots where they're not even acknowledging the contradictions?
Oh, yeah. No, they can't see things that are right in front of their face. Like just glaringly fucking obvious. I talked with a number of people about this issue across multiple different contexts. And yeah, the number of people who can't see second and third order consequences to things, when it should be like, it's fucking crayon obvious. How can you not extrapolate here?
But these are people who are supposedly common. These are people who are supposedly what you would call intelligent. They're at the top of a hierarchy of competence, be it tech or pharma. What's going wrong? I mean, what am I missing? Like, where is the failure? Is it a failure of this? Go ahead.
Social. It's social. It's completely at the social infrastructure. So I've worked for 30 years across Fortune 500 startups and all kinds of other shit. Most of the people in the executive office are like 5-year-olds. They're tantrum children. And by and large, like I would say probably close to 70% of that business class is just big adults having tantrums. These are really psychologically healthy people by and large, they have good social skills in terms of their emotional intelligence, or to be blunt, their ability to manipulate and
Right.
fuck with people.
And get power.
Yeah.
Mm.
So that's kind of what happens with bureaucracy in organizations too. You go from, you need some balance between heterodoxy and homodoxy. You need enough homodoxy in order to have this ability of social coherence. You need enough heterodoxy to be able to challenge and actually keep the system healthy and alive. If everything is homodoxy, then it drifts very quickly into orthodoxy and then dogma and ideology. It's slippery slope real fucking quick. That's basically what happens with bureaucracy, which I think is like an organizational cancer. These people come in, they establish their little node or cell, and then they start believing that they're the reason all this other thing is built up around them for. Mm-hmm. Because they're counting the beans, pushing the buttons or whatever. And I've watched that happen through a number of different organizations. Like that, I think, is one of the core patterns with, like, you get to everybody who starts thinking the same, and then people stop challenging at all. And it's to stop challenging your friends, like the behavioral discounting, whether it's yourself, your friends, your tribe, that opens up a whole fucking horizon of dysfunctional bullshit really, really quickly.
Yeah. So I just wonder on the biological level, if we circle back around to how people end up the way they do. I mean, like, I think if I was to look at it from the genetic perspective, I'd say, okay, well, they're so strongly bent towards this sort of alpha, non-competent, but supposedly confident alpha model, where it's just like dog eat dog world, you kill or be killed, you just do what you got to do and you block out the rest. Is it perhaps possible that that's just who they are, that's just the way they are, that it's not so much about what happened, or that mom and dad didn't teach them how to meditate or whatever it might be? What do you think?
There's definitely, we're looking at population dynamics, so there's going to be everything within that spectrum. So there are going to be people like that. I think that's one of the problems with these quick little moral phrases that people put up, and the whole harm care dynamic, especially as it comes across in Western Buddhism, which usually seems to be just idiot compassion. It's like there's a balance between compassion and wrath.
Right.
Like, you need to have that compassion.
Yeah. That comes from Choi Gyum Trungpa.
Yeah, I've got one of his books up here on the shelf.
Interesting guy.
Yeah, he
was sleeping with a lot of people's wives, but he was a great meditator, Longstone. That's what you have to know. He was a wonderful meditator.
Here we get into it. Here's a guy who took advantage of this Western idea of Buddhist compassion kind of came in on the coattails of the hippie movement.
Yes.
So some of that came in with the fascination of like far off Eastern culture and stuff like that. But at the same time, around 1967, Namgyal Rinpoche, who was one of the first was the first Westerner to be recognized as a reincarnated Rinpoche, was recognized in Burma and came to Canada in 1967 to set up the first Buddhist center outside of Asia anywhere. Mm-hmm. So there are two parallel threads. There's like this narrow thread of like people who have actually tied in, and then you kind of have the groupie culture that goes on around that with the tourists and everything else. And I see something very similar has happened with the IDW now, where there's some interesting conversation, and then there's a few people who are trying to build a fucking brand around it.
Right, and I know who you're talking about. And I wonder sometimes why the really smart ones associate themselves with the brandy ones.
It's a trade-off between having anybody to listen to your ideas. Mm-hmm. Like how do you get it out there? If you're actually having an intelligent conversation, it's very fucking hard to get an audience if you're past a certain level. Right.
Yeah.
If you want to have a Sam Harris level conversation, then lots of people are into that. If you want to go past that, the field narrows quickly.
Little dig at Sam there. Well, tell me, what's your thoughts on Sam?
I think he's just tapping out cognitively in terms of his understanding of free will, his whole conversation about morality and the sacred with Peterson. Like I just think he's tapped out cognitively. I think he's probably sitting at about 128 IQ, and he just doesn't have the resources to go to that next level of abstraction. So, he did an interview with I can't remember Barry's last name, from Psychology Today. Or no, sorry, the Psychology
Barry
podcast.
Weiss? Is that what you're saying?
No, no, Barry's a psychologist as well. He's done some stuff on. I won't say anything further. Anyways, with his video, he and Sam were talking about free will, and then Sam gets into this thing about you're going to have a right and wrong answer to the question, and that kind of sets it all for me. So I talked to you before about this chain from point to line to area to volume to abstraction to calibrated abstraction.
Right.
Sam's still down here at the line, oscillating between black and white in terms of his philosophical or his modeling construct of the problem he's trying to solve. Right or wrong answers. Like, really, Sam? There's like 15 chains of complexity in here that we need to look at, and you're looking at a right and wrong answer. Like, it just belies to me the underlying framework that you're working with is not up to the task of what you're trying to do.
Yes, that could be the case. That could be the case. It could also be the case that he's robustly intelligent, but just isn't clicking in the creative areas where you can abstract at a level like a Carl Jung or a Peterson or these people who have that mythological
I
layer.
think there's something about a sigma boundary in there that's a legitimate is
Yeah, it could be the case. I'm not sure, but I mean, one thing that's interesting is that I've always found the free will, his argument against free will to be deeply troubling, because you use the word complexity. There's a lot of different ways to negate it. First, there's complexity. There's emergence theory. There's top-down regulation. Then there's the idea of we still don't know what the fuck consciousness is. That we haven't resolved is panpsychism a possibility? Is the brain a receptor of consciousness, like Ian McGilchrist suggests and others? We don't really know how it's produced, and so when these sort of atheists come along and say that consciousness is just the result of the mechanisms of complex brain functions, it's like, well, maybe, but like, you're not giving the devil his due here, man.
Yeah, I think you're on point with that. I had something else I wanted to address there, but I think I lost it.
But there are areas where Sam is much more lucid and impressive in my estimation.
He gets some gems occasionally. I'll give him that. He said a few things where I'm like, well, it was something in the same conversation, actually. He was talking about ego, how ego is this state from adolescent development. You need to develop ego so there is some structure there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just kind of the process of building up the substructure.
Mm-hmm.
But once the ego is there, you need to fucking demolish it and move on.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're attached to it, it's a developmental phase that becomes detrimental if you hang on to it later in life. Sam made that point. I'm like, absolutely, dude. Right on the nose. Perfect.
Right.
Absolutely. That's a good insight that I have not actually seen in many other places.
Yes.
Totally
yeah.
Legit.
Well, he has many interesting things to say, but yeah, let's talk about ego for a second, because now that you brought it up, I'm thinking about, what do we really mean when we say the word ego? I'm a critic of the terms that we've carried around and used like they mean something when we don't understand the antecedents of the word properly. So the way that Freud used the word ego was the ego was a manager. That's all it was. It's like, I have these impulses, instincts, and then I have this social pressure, and I have to figure out how to mitigate. That was it. And then, of course, there's other lines that, like, from Latin, it just means self. It just means I'm a thing, that I know I exist. In Hinduism,
Ego is the social persona. It is the social construct of self, because it's that interface, all of the stuff around the serotonin mechanisms, status and everything else, all that is tied into the social dimension across the limbic system there. So I think it's at the one point, ego is trapped between the dorsal and ventral vagus.
Mm-hmm. That's
It's
fascinating.
that emotional protection of self, coupled with that social aspect through those two layers of the nervous system, like sub cortex layers of the nervous system. So the ego is trapped in there. It becomes a mediator to the higher consciousness, but that mediator needs to disappear because it's like a fixed anchor point. So that's why people who are attached and in that ego state, that's why you're seeing people in their 30s who still act as if they're in high school, or developmentally no different than someone you run into in high school. They kind of attach to that state and they don't feel a need to keep developing. They're kind of like the apex there.
Mm-hmm.
So if you haven't gone through that transformation of the ego, I guess, or whatever experience triggers that dissolution or death of ego in order to rebuild again, it's like kind of leveling up a character. You need to shed some of the stuff off. Like
I just think we need a new heuristic for I think we need a new heuristic. I don't think the word ego is working anymore because it's a dirty word. Ego, oh, he's got a big ego. It's like we don't really know what we mean. We mean 3,000 different things when we say the word ego. Oh, he has a healthy ego. It's like you shouldn't have an ego. Don't have an ego. There's all these taboos around ego. And I much prefer the idea of unique circuits that are obviously sometimes shared because of our phylogenetic basis, but also genetically and developmentally distinct. And yeah, you might have a social circuit or you might have a complicated basis for social interactions that's sometimes more arbitrary or vain. But see, it's more the way that I think about it is it allows us to get to the phenomenological root of what's actually being experienced. My concern is when we use a word like ego, which actually, depending on what psychologist you're talking to, means something different, is that we're not actually, it's not a good heuristic. But that's just me.
That's where I think the social construct aspect of it's a functional definition of where it fits within psychology of self and self to other.
Yeah.
So it's a boundary space or boundary construct.
Yeah.
In that sense. So there's something else that's come up back of my head a couple of times. You ever seen Westworld or watched that show?
No, I haven't yet. Okay. But I know what it's about.
Okay. So the hosts or the robots in that show, I think, are probably the best psychological model you have for like Joe and Jane Average. They have some basic story that, kind of they fixate on, it defines their lives, and they just kind of run with that. Except the hosts on Westworld, they have a diagnostic mode, which most people don't have, and they have the ability to limit affect, which most people don't have. So I think that the journey of self-awareness in Westworld is basically the one that people should be doing developmentally through teenage years, through those rites of passage, rituals, and all that other stuff. So in order to, that's where the intelligence thing and how to do this. So you need some aspect of metacognition. So I think that kind of kicks in to a degree by default, 140 plus. It will just manifest because there's enough resource there for it to manifest. Doesn't mean it'll do it well, because I've met people who are literally aeronautical engineers who are fucking clueless about any kind of psychology or social dynamic stuff at all. They're just trapped in their conservative window and that's it. So being high in IQ doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have metacognition. And there are people who I've seen who aren't necessarily high in IQ, but the system is coherent. So they have integrity, thereby wisdom out of that. And with lesser resources, they're running in a much more optimal condition. So two of those things are happening. It's not one or the other. There's some interplay between it. So just being smart, doesn't matter how smart you are if your social strata and the cultural strata has been salted, which is basically what consumerism has done. in large part, and all these appeals to the limbic system over the the brain. Like I think it's the default modes network. So if
Yep.
you've gone tying into neuroplasticity, if you go and develop these modes, driving car, driving tractor, cutting wood, whatever, these are kind of different cognitive and physiological things that you can train yourself for. I think the earlier you get more experience, you've got more depth to build on. You try doing these things at 30 or 40, the neuroplasticity isn't there. But if you at least laid some track, you've got a line through the bush. It's much easier to clear than cutting raw trees from scratch.
Right. And you can still, I mean, it just takes a tremendous amount of focus. You can still change your brain after 30.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah.
we had this really fixed idea of like, oh, you get to childhood age and, or you get to your early 20s and the fluid intelligence drops and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
I don't think that is as hard and fast. It's probably very true of the bell end of the bell curve, but it's not true of the tails, I don't think. So there are different phenomenological things happening at different sigma points towards the higher IQ scale.
Yes. Yeah. Intelligence is such a fascinating subject. I mean, on the one hand, I wonder about the cultural context, right? Because we're interpreting it through can this person operate in this way, which happens to map onto functions that we have decided to value economically and all these complex ways in which it plays out. And then the other thing is what are the ways in which we're actually not fully tapping into intelligence on a research level, and where is it going to go in the future? Because I think, as you know, IQ is one of the most robust things that have come out of psychology in terms of its ability to be a predictor and to tell people something actually meaningful. Unfortunately.
Have you looked much at the Flynn effect?
Tell me about it. The Quinn effect?
The Flynn effect.
Flynn effect.
James, no. James Flynn calls himself a moral psychologist, but he did moral philosopher, did a deep dive into philosophy. He was very influenced by a Russian named Alexander Luria. So Luria had these 3 points that there were 3 psychotechnologies that made the distinction between the pre-modern and the modern mind. So it was abstraction, proper application of the hypothetical, and one other that I'm just brain farting on right now. But these cognitive tools, and you've got the interplay between individual cognition and the cultural strata. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter how smart you are, there's only so much you can accumulate within a lifetime, and that's also going to be bound by the environment that you're in.
Yeah. So
we're in a different space right now with the digital world such as it is, but that's never been true of any other point in human history. So the 3 psychotechnologies of abstraction, the hypothetical, and why can I not remember the last one? These are basically they're the lowest level psychotechnology of which we can build higher order tools.
Is the other one delayed discounting?
No, these are strictly conceptual.
Okay, got it.
I'll have to dig it up and then you can put or just search James Flynn on TED Talks. Anyways, that's a background. Flynn's work was on something called the Flynn effect, where he looked at the way IQ has been mapped and studied since the beginning of studying it. So early on, it was a lot of concrete knowledge. So who won the 1932 World Series or whatever? So if that's common cultural knowledge, great, but it doesn't really tell you shit about anyone's intelligence. It tells you whether they're. So as the study of IQ went on, it shifted less from concrete cultural specific knowledge to abstract knowledge. And from the period of 1900 to 1970, the IQ across the population, so 100 IQ at 1900 No, sorry, the other way. What was considered 100 IQ in 19 would have been 130 at 1900. So there's a 30-point increase in IQ across the population.
Mm.
So I think this is cultural strata. You've got the basis of the core psychotechnology tools for people to kind of bootstrap and go up from there.
Yeah.
This is a shift from rural agrarian to higher population density, which means increased communication.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So like everything else, it's a double-edged sword, but you have this shift where we had access to all this information and people got relatively smarter. The hardware didn't change. The software layer was upgraded effectively. Brett Weinstein will talk about this a lot. This is the software layer that we have to work with.
Yes.
The hardware that most people are running is probably adequate. It's just they're running a fucking garbage operating system.
Yeah.
That's developmentally like a 10 or 12-year-old in many cases.
Yeah.
So I think the whole idea of enlightenment isn't sages and mystics or whatever. It's just fucking adulthood. And it's not really an option anymore. It's requirement for the survival of the species.
Yeah. We're in a very turbulent time. One of the things that happens to Longstone is that, at least in my observation, is that we have such a poor ability to deal with nuance. For example, is Western society perfect? No. Does that mean we should burn it to the ground? No. I mean, is there a way in which you can save the baby that's in that bathwater and still be critical without being automatically put into a camp that says, oh, well, this guy's a conservative, or this guy's a postmodernist, or this guy's a whatever. We have these categories that don't sufficiently explain the complexity of the situation. And anytime someone like an Eric or a Brett Weinstein try to reference multiple domains with a complex view, they unfortunately get misheard by most people, and they get assumed, oh, well, that's the IDW.
They get a brick wall because they don't have the frame of reference in many cases, so they're ignorant of the data. And there's other cases where people just don't have the cognitive horsepower to actually address the issues, and there's a lot of other cases where they just don't want to put in the effort.
Yeah,
it's really just too much effort. They don't see where the value is because you can't explain that until you get over the hill and see the vista.
Yeah. I find Eric to be staggeringly brilliant. One thing about Eric that I notice is he's very open-minded to a romantic or mythopoetic sensibility, and it shines through. And at the same time, you can see how he still has that rigid scientist inside of him, that sense-making part of him that says, yeah, I can honor these phenomenological experiences of beauty, but what's really interesting to me is what's going on down here,
under the hood.
Yeah, what's going on under the hood. So I find Eric to be a refreshing voice. I mean, sometimes I wonder if he doesn't fully understand the occult or esoteric piece that you seem to hold so valuable, but he definitely is open to it. I mean, do you think that's a fair take?
Yeah, I think there are a number of people who are open to it, and I don't know. To look at it, so there aren't that many. I forget. There's like 7-8 million people in the province of Ontario. At this point in time, there's about 40,000 Freemasons. There are about 4,000 Royal Archmasons, of which I'm also a member. So that distribution goes down. The number of people involved in these organizations, as you go further up the chain, becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So there aren't that many people who've done this depth of a dive into Western mystery traditions. So I started with work from Paul Foster Case and some of the early California esoteric scene. So Case's work I like. There's a few that came out of there, but the California, like since the 1920s and 30s, has been spiritual tourism. This is one of the issues I had with the guys who sell the overly priced caffeine.
Bulletproof?
No.
I don't know.
Qualia Mind.
Oh,
Qualia Mind.
okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, I don't know. California's always had this fucking guru mentality thing.
Well, I mean, it's present
always
all
like
over the place. It's in the West. I mean, it's California's kind of the spearhead, but this whole guru new age culture it's present
everywhere now. But I mean, it kind of started there, I think, in the 20s and 30s. It's not like there were never aspects of it before, but it kind of became an industry of its own in California in the 20s and 30s.
Again,
kind of esoteric revival.
But we're back to the complexity issue, I think. I mean, can you have an understanding of spirituality that doesn't include a monocentric path where you abandon other nuanced ways of thinking? Can you hold the complexity of both end? And I think oftentimes the answer for people is no. I can't do it. I just can't do it.
Yeah, and it might be practice, it might be frame of reference, it might be just the tools that they have access to. So I think
when I was 20, I thought I needed direct contact with a guru. I mean, I was meditating. I was trying to develop myself. So I thought, well, I need some sort of guru to manifest itself to me. I need contact with, like I read Autobiography of a Yogi, but it's not up there anymore. Have you read Autobiography of a Yogi?
No, I think I know the book and the author, though, that you're talking about.
Paramahansa Yogananda. So it's just a series of these fantastical stories on his journey towards enlightenment and bringing enlightenment to the West. And it's
okay. Check out Mitch Horowitz. He has a bunch of background research on who these guys actually were.
Oh, really? Is it critical, or is it just objective, or what do you make of it?
Well, these were a bunch of white guys who wrote on their pen names, but who were actually, it seems, tuned into some aspect of Hermetic tradition.
You think that was the case for Paramahansa Yogananda?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's one of the guys that got.
Because he was definitely a historical person that was Indian. He wasn't white. There's several photographs of him. But I don't really care about that. I mean, I care. I think it's interesting, but that's not my point. My point is that I had this simplified view of what it would look like to reach some sort of enlightenment or self-development. And what happened was, slowly over time, I developed my rational function. From the time I was 20 till about 23, I did a lot of thinking, I met Dr. Strachan, who is a very rigorous logician, I think. And some of the bubbles that I was living in began to burst, and my capacity for complexity grew exponentially. And I think part of the reason for that was because my brain was still developing. So I was, your brain doesn't fully finish developing until you're 20.
You're probably catching up on a backlog, so you're just hungry for that stuff.
Yeah, I was catching up. I was also developmentally struggled with addiction, behavioral issues, alcoholism treatment, rehab. I mean, just like a kind of just tumultuous teenagehood. Let's just put it that way. And so even though I was a philosopher ever since I was 8 or 9 years old, I was a deep thinker. I mean, the first time I ever I was contemplating death and what does it mean by the time I was 6 years old, just like you wrote in your blog. You were asking incredibly difficult questions. What happened was that let's call it the addict subpersonality, which I think Peterson creates a really interesting picture of how these situations play out. Basically, if you have a proclivity to a certain coping style, whether it's addiction or depression, um, or stealing or crime or whatever it might be, and there's enough pressure put on your system, then the likelihood, the probability that you will resort to
Yes.
that particular thing goes way up. So I had a
Yeah.
proclivity. That's where the genetics come in, and where the life experience comes in. Is that's how I used that. That was my coping style. But at any rate, I think there are a lot of educational mishaps that happened for me. Like I never went down mathematics. There was too much going on. I wasn't going to school. And so I didn't have the opportunity to strengthen some of those potential skills that I could have had at that age. But by the time I got sober, for a couple of years, and I started with this, as you say, low resolution view of spirituality. The healthier and the cleaner I got, and the more I practiced complex thinking, the more I was able to have conversations like the one I'm having with you right now. And the more I was able to say to people at university, what the fuck are you talking about? There's no difference between men and women. It doesn't, I mean, I'm no Einstein, but I know that's not right.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of my background, but this is another thing, a problem I have with education is that, you know, I'm no dummy. Now I'm not gonna say that I'm the smartest guy in the world, but I'm not dumb. I have a robust brain. I can think in abstract terms. I can extrapolate. I can hang with you. I can understand what you're saying. I can hang with Dr. Strachan. But for some reason, the situations that I went through did not foster the potential I had to perhaps be even more well developed at this point in my life than I am now.
I think our culture is at a deficit that way. So I think part of this is the shift from agrarian to city or rural to city. So there are different cultural conditions there. And in the country, the education stuff's not that important in terms of the abstract education. You need to know what the fuck is going on around you in the world environment. And your education is going to be the physical things of like crops and animal husbandry and whatever else. So in those contexts, there's much less need or possibility for more abstract development. When you get to push into cities, then that kind of happens. But where else was I going with that? But I think there's a couple of parallel things that are affecting people there. So historically speaking, we kind of had this caste. We've always had a caste system, and then we've been breaking down the substrate of it. So there were like kings and everybody else. Mm-hmm. And then in the Middle Ages, you get the emergence of a mercantile class in between the kings and everybody else, where mm-hmm. you start to get that thing kind of breaking down. Those people who were in the upper class had access to not just education about the world, but like social education. These are the social patterns that you need to pick up, even if they're abstract and kind of arbitrary, but these are the ones you need to pick up if you're going to be interacting with thousands of people rather than just the people in your village. Mm-hmm. So without that aspect of the face-to-face knowledge and some kind of social bond, you're dealing with abstract relationships out. That whole thing needs to change. So part of the problem of this push from rural into urban is you got people bringing all their shit from all their dysfunctional inbred families and whatever else. And I say this is fucking being one of them. Like my family was a fucking gong show, both sides.
Oh man. My
mom's side of the family, there's 3 or 4 different factions of people don't fucking talk to each other.
Right.
So, and then in the 60s, well, people have just kind of gotten settled in. They're still carrying this baggage. And then we get this idea of everybody's opinion's right. Everybody's opinion matters and it is of equal value. So you get all this dysfunctional bullshit that's kind of pushed in now under ever increasing pressure because the world basically doesn't exist. Almost everything is urban now. And people are just bringing all their dysfunctional codependent bullshit from their families and kind of projected it out into broader society.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And you know, like for all the difficulties that it, that I experienced through education, I mean, far from being a victim, I just had to figure it out. I had to get my shit together. Get, because there was really no one to blame but myself at the end of the day. It was like, okay, well, that's not ideal, but no one else is going to do anything about it but me. So I got to fix this. And what I wonder about though is like, given the fact that I was asking incredibly deep questions, I was very inquisitive about philosophy and poetry and certain things like that, and I just wonder if there was the right person, say, everybody, not everybody can have their own Socrates, but like, just a mentor or something. I just wonder what the outcome would have been. If you find that at the right time in your life. I was lucky enough to find it in my 20s, but I think for a lot of people out there, the traditional education system is failing to provide something that could actually be really dynamic and actually create a tremendous amount of output for society.
I think there's an aspect of public education, like the lowest common denominator stuff, that needs to remain kind of the factory assembly, because when you're dealing with everybody from everywhere, that's the level of gradient we can get. But we need something adjunct to that. That can't be it. There's got to be something to address the individual layer of things, because I think in terms of our development, like individuation is the key defense against mimesis.
Yeah.
You start getting into mimetics, and then it's just everything kind of crushes down. It's just like this degrading tape loop.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you have individuation, then you have increase of experience in terms of complexity, in terms of the breadth of experience, like all these kind of power up, value add things that come to engaging the world through that process, through process and methodology, rather than the narrative or the mimetics.
Right. Have you heard of Tom Brown Jr.?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, so this guy, survival teacher, teaches primitive skills. So everything from bow drill to hand drill to stalking to hunting, and the idea is to be as minimalist as possible. So I've taken several of his courses, and he's a very interesting guy. But one of his students, his name is John Young, who went on to be what is now a very prominent naturalist and survival skills teacher. And the way that he taught John is through a method called coyote teaching. And I think you'll find this interesting. So he was living in the same neighborhood as John Young when John was growing up as a kid. And one day Tom was driving back to his house on the old dirt road, and he saw John playing in the creek with a snapping turtle, trying to pick up a snapping turtle. And he thought, oh, this kid, maybe I could teach this kid some survival skills. So what he did was Tom acted like a complete idiot. And Tom is one of the most competent survivalists in the country. He's been hired to track fugitives. He could go out in the woods buck naked in negative degrees and survive. We're talking high skills. So he says, well, I'm not going to teach this guy linearly. I'm not going to tell him what he needs to learn. I'm going to play dumb and ask him a bunch of questions. And by the time he's 20, he's going to be an expert in the wilderness. He's going to know every bird call. He's going to know what the animals are doing. He's going to know how to read the tracks. He's going to know how to set up traps. He's going to know how to survive in the wilderness and identify edible plants. I mean, everything, all the complexity of primitive survival, which for people that don't know, it's there's a lot to it, more than just grab stick and beat thing. It's a lot
of it's very regional as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very complicated, and it requires intelligence all of its own. But so by the time John was, an adult, he still didn't know Tom was like this master. And it's called coyote teaching. It's when you teach someone, it's mentoring. It's when you mentor someone without them knowing that they're being mentored. They're just kind of going along for the ride. So Tom would say, go to this area over here and look for this, and notice where the sun's at and see what you find over here. And it just, he would craft it carefully in a way that would result in learning. And
So like you're coming around a conceptual corner and then all of a sudden the vista appears.
yes, you nailed it. That's exactly how. So this guy, he's going to college and he's baffled because people don't understand in his social group. They don't understand the ways of nature. He's like, what the fuck? Doesn't everybody know this stuff? And then he saw a best-selling book called The Tracker by Tom Brown Jr. And he realized that his teacher was a fucking survivalist. Yeah. So I thought you would like that story because it reminds me of what you're talking about higher orders of thinking and.
Well, it's also, he's learning through the approach network, which is how children are supposed to fucking learn.
Right.
Not straight up mimicry. It's supposed to be engaging the approach network, and all these wider systems are kicking off and running. Whereas if it's TD or sitting down to be lectured at, it's just mimicry. Straight up mimicry. Monkey see, monkey do. There's no depth to it.
Comes back to your first point, which is, I think you called it second order learning. Is that what you call it?
They call it system 1 and system 2. So
System
the two learning, so fast and slow is the principal designation. But the fast learning is mimetics, narrative, mimicry, all that stuff. Quick access. It's maybe not robust, it's maybe not high resolution, but it's good enough for now.
Right.
Whereas the system 2 is actually engaging the executive network, doing complex problem solving, and all of these other higher order systems.
Yes. Yeah. And so I guess the circling back to the educational system, I guess the question is, how could we create heuristics for children, and I think even for college students, where they stumble into aha moments more often? You know, obviously there's always going to be a time and a place to say, to give one-to-one teaching, you know, this is that. And you know, you're always going to have to spell things out to some extent. But I wonder, what would that look like if we created an educational system like that?
I'm not thinking in a whole system, but just in context, reusable tool, breaking dichotomy. So breaking the ping pong effect, the dualism. So I can't remember if I sent you any of the symbolism stuff, but I have this thing called like a sarcophagus posture. So you're trapped in yourself of your own making. Mm-hmm. So you're in this space and you get to a point of like, I can't take it anymore and I don't want to be in this. So it becomes nihilism and you kind of push away.
Right.
But as long as your arms are outstretched, keeping that thing away, you're still attached to it. You're still completely bound to it. Nothing has changed until you can take those 2 points and come up into a third point, like create a geometry. Then we have a two-dimensional geometry. So there's from point to line. Here's where we go to area.
Right.
And then we can go to volume and start tessellating spaces of experience outwards. Mm. So I think this tessellation of consciousness is you have a perspective, you have a second perspective, you develop a synthesis. There you have the tessellation. So each of those points of perspective can overlap into others, and you can start digging out into domains. So this can be a specific perspective, whether you want to map it temperamentally or something onto a specific issue, or this can be the interrelationship between different domains of knowledge.
Right. Right.
So you can start linking these things together. The more your model matches what's actually in the real world, the less energy you have to spend in translation IO, trying to correlate what's happening out there to the model internally. So there's that idea, some people use like mental houses or castles as their filing system. It's almost like a mnemonic device.
Yeah.
Instead of using a castle, if you use the world and you're mapping the knowledge back into the physical things and systems in some way that's coherent for you, then you spend a lot less time on the overhead processing of trying to figure out the in and out and the signal processing, and you can just deal with the data processing. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, I gotta actually go to another meeting in a few minutes, so I'm gonna have to wrap up, but that was fascinating and a lot of fun. I appreciate you sharing your ideas. And oh, actually, I'd like to continue talking with you because I'm writing my dissertation right now on the phenomenology of subpersonalities in conversation with Jungian individuation and depth psychology as a whole. And what I really want to look at is I want to look at the layer, the biological layer, and then I want to look at the phenomenological layer of subpersonalities. And actually, the reason I brought up ego is because one of the things I want to do is potentially showcase how at any given moment we can actually think of ourselves as in one or more subpersonalities. So we can create a new way of understanding psychology in the sense that there is no moment where you're not in one of your various selves. It just doesn't happen. Now, you might be in your soul self or your synthesized self where there's more of a cohesion or a congruence or a flow state, so to speak. But I'd like to exercise this idea because I think fundamentally a lot of the heuristics that we're using in modern psychology to try to explain what's happening in people's psyches, especially through the language of order and disorder and mental health and mental illness, is failing us. I think we need new ways to explain the phenomenology of the psyche. So the reason I say all this to you is because I would love to talk to you about these ideas, because I think you've got a robust mind that could just give me feedback along the way. So I know you're a busy guy, but every once in a while, if I may, I'll bounce some ideas off of you.
Yeah, I'm happy to chat anytime.
Cool. All right. Well, anything else before I let you go?
No, nothing off the top of my head. We kind of rambled all over the place. I lost my track a few times, but we'll have to do it again.
All right. Sounds good. Hey, talk soon.
I will forward the other images and article I was talking about as well.
Okay,
So
right on.
For that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. All right, looking forward to talking again.
Okay, take care, man. Have a good one.
Bye.